all began here. A journey that shaped Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. A movement to stand for what is right. Over a century later, on his birth anniversary, India's only international channel is here in South Africa.
Today it has engulfed the entire country. Business owners are complaining of financial...
Going behind the headlines to bring you reports from the heart of the nation. WION, coming soon to South Africa.
America's retreat from Afghanistan has left behind a void, one that could prove to be catastrophic if left unfilled. China and Pakistan are looking to exploit this power vacuum. Islamabad wants to turn Afghanistan into its sixth province. Beijing wants to use Afghanistan as a corridor to Central Asia. It's being called the new axis of evil. What does this axis mean for Afghanistan's future? What repercussions will it have in South Asia? Can it upend the existing geopolitical dynamics? Watch Gravitas US edition live from Washington, D.C. with me, Palki Sharma Upadhyay, only on WION. World is One.
Gravitas live and direct from WION Studios in Washington, D.C.
Hello and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. It's 9 p.m. IST, 11:30 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. A rainy, windy morning, lovely weather, not broadcast friendly, but we're bringing you a live show. The Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, is on his way to the US capital. He should land in a few hours from now and begin his engagements tomorrow. Apart from meeting Quad leaders in Washington, D.C., Prime Minister Modi will also engage with some business leaders, CEOs of tech companies. Of course, we'll be tracking all of those events as they happen and bringing you live updates. At the moment, we can tell you the action is in New York. The United Nations General Assembly is underway. The debate is underway, and already health authorities have found their first cases of the Wuhan virus. Brazil's health minister, Marcelo Queiroga, has tested positive. He accompanied President Jair Bolsonaro to the General Assembly yesterday. We told you how President Bolsonaro came unvaccinated and he was denied entry to a restaurant, so he ate pizza on the street. Now his minister has tested positive, the same minister who was present during Bolsonaro's meeting with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. This minister is now in quarantine. He is the second member of the Brazilian delegation to contract the virus. Over the weekend, a diplomat had tested positive. He was part of the advance team that was preparing for President Bolsonaro's visit. Reports say the rest of the Brazilian delegation so far has tested negative, but the virus scare is very much there. Then we have the speeches. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan addressed the assembly on Tuesday. What do you think he talked about? Kashmir, among other things. It's becoming a favorite subject of his at the UNGA. He brings it up every year. Erdogan said that the dispute should be resolved within the framework of the United Nations resolutions. India has responded in kind. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar held a meeting with his counterpart from Cyprus. It's a tit-for-tat move. Jaishankar said that everyone should adhere to the United Nations resolutions on the Cyprus dispute. Now remember, Cyprus was split after a Turkish invasion in 1974, and this created Northern Cyprus, which is being recognized only by Turkey. According to the rest of the world, this territory still belongs to Cyprus. And this is the dispute that India highlighted. Guess who else wants to speak at the UNGA? The Taliban. They want an invite to the United Nations. Their foreign minister has written a letter to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and he has made two demands. Number one, to nominate their spokesman Suhail Shaheen as Afghanistan's envoy to the UN, and number two, to participate in the ongoing general debate. The foreign minister Amir Khan Muttaqi wants to make a speech. Will the UN allow it? Well, it looks unlikely at the moment. UN accreditation is determined by a special committee. It has 9 members, including the US, Russia and China. Now, this committee usually meets around October or November. But this UNGA session ends on Monday, so technically it's too late unless the world community bends over backwards to invite the Taliban. Fingers crossed, that won't happen. As it stands, Ghulam Isakzai is Afghanistan's representative. He was appointed by the Ashraf Ghani government. His UNGA address is scheduled for Monday. The Taliban say Isakzai's mission is over and that he no longer represents Afghanistan. And frankly, I don't understand the Taliban's eagerness. They may not have an envoy in New York, but they have the next best thing. They have Shah Mahmood Qureshi, Pakistan's foreign minister. His UNGA mission was off to a rocky start. Pakistan found itself isolated even before the session kicked off. Let me tell you what happened. Nepal was convening a SAARC foreign ministers meeting at the UNGA. One tiny problem. Who would represent Afghanistan? Now, Pakistan's position was clear on this. Invite the Taliban, they said, and keep the ousted government's envoy out. None of the other countries agreed. They refused to invite the Taliban, and so the meeting was cancelled. You could say it sums up the story of SAARC. A grouping full of potential, held back by one member, Pakistan. And just to be clear, none of the SAARC members recognize the Taliban regime, not even Pakistan technically. So what was the hurry to invite them to SAARC? Is it because Pakistan is losing control of the Taliban? Well, that's very much a possibility. Things are not going well between godfather and godchild, or master and proxy, whatever you want to call it. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan is lobbying for an inclusive Taliban government. Not because he loves inclusivity or equality, but because it's easier to market. Here's what he said in a recent interview, and I'm quoting, "If the Taliban do not have an inclusive government and gradually descends into a civil war, that will impact Pakistan. A chaotic and unstable Afghanistan is an ideal place for terrorists." Imran Khan said this. He also slammed the Taliban's ban on women's education. He called it un-Islamic. So where is this criticism coming from? Pakistan is using the Haqqani network to control the Taliban, but their Kandahar faction is unhappy. These are Afghan nationalists opposed to Pakistani interference. Here's what the Information Minister Zabiullah Mujahid said. Pakistan or any country has no right to ask the Islamic Emirate to establish an inclusive government in Afghanistan. And they're not stopping at words. Let me show you what happened at the Torkham border. A Pakistani truck was stationed at the checkpost. It had a Pakistani flag on the windshield. Taliban fighters charged the truck and tore down the flag. Look at how this played out. So much for being a godfather. Pakistani flags being shredded by the Taliban. And what does Islamabad do? Lobby for them at the United Nations. Tells you how the power equations are changing. Pakistan may have cultivated this monster, but controlling it is not going to be easy. And we are already seeing the repercussions. The Tehreek-e-Taliban have stepped up attacks in Pakistan. At least 52 Pakistani security officials were killed last month. Even Pakistani cricket is suffering. Two countries have refused to play in Pakistan, England and New Zealand. Both cited security concerns. This is the cost of supporting the Taliban. Imran Khan can try to reform them, or say he's trying, but it won't work. Look at their cabinet expansion. Another all-male list of ministers. The Taliban have come with an agenda, and no one, not even Pakistan, they say, can deter them. Their latest target is the IPL, the Indian Premier League. The tournament is underway in the UAE. A few Afghan cricketers are also playing, but back home in Afghanistan, no one can watch them play because the Taliban have banned IPL broadcast. And wait till you hear why. The Indian Premier League has cheerleaders. It has female spectators. Not all of them wear burqas. So the Taliban is calling the IPL anti-Islamic content. Just a reminder, the tournament is happening in the United Arab Emirates, a Muslim monarchy that uses the Sharia law. They have no problems with the IPL, but the Taliban do. As we keep saying, this is not about religion or culture. This is about a bigoted vision, a group of power-hungry terrorists with some new and powerful allies. of allies, there are two countries that are aligning their policies to make the Taliban sway to their tunes. No prizes for guessing which countries we're talking about. Pakistan and China, of course. They're both trying to work with the Taliban. Ever since America withdrew from Afghanistan, both Islamabad and Beijing have been cheering for the Taliban. They consider it a mutual friend. That can be used against a mutual adversary, which is India. So a nexus between the three, China, Pakistan and the Taliban, is emerging. And it's a reality that the world needs to come to terms with and race for. At the same time, we must seek answers to some important questions that arise. What does this nexus mean for South Asia and for India? What security ramifications will it have for the region and beyond? And how worried should India be? How can the world mount an effective counter-response? To take these questions and more, let me introduce you to the guests that we have today in our Washington studios. We have Jamil N. Jaffer. He is the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute in the Bush administration. He served at the White House as an associate counsel to the president. We also have with us Brian Lanza, Republican strategist and former communications director to President Trump's transition team. Jamil and Brian, welcome to WION.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Jamil, if I begin with you, you've worked with the White House. You've dealt with intelligence matters closely. What kind of support do you think Pakistan is still lending to the Taliban?
Well, look, Palki, we know that the Taliban were a creation of the Pakistani ISI, right? There's no question about that. And so Pakistan's long been supporting the Taliban. They've been part of their organization. They've really built them up, kept them going during the U.S. occupation, and have now permitted a lot of their fighters to come back in across the border and essentially empowered what's taken place over the last few weeks and months as the Taliban have swept across Afghanistan, taking power in that country.
You worked with President Trump, who very famously once slammed Pakistan for quote-unquote lies and deceit in the war on terror.
Correct.
Why do you think the current American administration is wary of calling out Pakistan and its role in this Taliban crisis?
Listen, I just think President Joe Biden's in a tremendously weak position with the withdrawal of American troops in Afghanistan. And being in that weak position, it gives him little authority to go to actors in the region and act tough and ask for strong standards and ask for Pakistan and its satellite, the Taliban, and in Afghanistan to set proper standards for how to be part of the international community rather than dictate that they need specific meetings. The standards are pretty clear what the international community wants out of Afghanistan. President Biden seems a little bit scared to push, but this is where the international community will step in and hopefully put the right standards forward.
Is the international community going to step in is a question, because the Americans are working on a quad vis-a-vis Afghanistan, where Pakistan is very much going to be a member. And the world has seen what happens when you make Pakistan an ally in the so-called war on terror. Why do you think they keep repeating the same mistakes?
Well, in a lot of ways, there's not a lot of good options to the United States, right? Now that we've completely withdrawn our forces from Afghanistan, we've removed our capabilities at the Bagram Air Base. We're trying to run this quote-unquote over-the-horizon counterterrorism capacity, but we can't do that without basing rights, without the ability to deliver capabilities in the region. And Pakistan is there right now. We know that Pakistan's constantly playing that double game, right? Telling us one thing on one hand, helping us here and there, but then also working with the Taliban and supporting them also. And so we've seen this show over and over again. You're exactly right. We've seen this thing happen, and yet there are not a lot of good options. And so that really is the challenge the United States presents itself when we've now withdrawn, as Brian points out, from this area in that precipitous way that we did.
So is that how it is, that because you're not really spoiled for options, you will continue to work with a country like Pakistan that has been the architect of this crisis?
It's sad, but it's true. Oftentimes the decision an American president makes is bad and worse. It's never good or bad. And the decision in the Middle East, a lot of these decisions are bad and even more bad. And you have to. We're going to be skeptical of everything Pakistan does. We're going to have clear vision of who they are. We're not going to be tricked per se. But we still have to apply the pressure. But they're an actor in the region, and you can't ignore them. And we have to work with our allies, not necessarily to isolate them, but to make sure that they move up the standards in human rights. They move up the standards, in trying to create a vibrant economy, and that's the best approach you can do with this president, because he doesn't have the political power or the political will right now to push anybody to be assertive in this matter.
Where do you think China comes into this picture? China and Pakistan are hand in glove, and the Chinese are rolling out the red carpet for the Taliban. They're engaging with them. do you see China as part of the problem or the solution?
Well, certainly it could be part of the problem. I mean, part of the challenge with China is they see a strategic opportunity there. Bagram Air Base is a huge facility, a real opportunity for China to expand in the region. They're looking to expand the Belt and Road Initiative, where they already have close economic relations with Pakistan, $60 billion in investment. They're going to expand that to Afghanistan. And it's, Afghanistan's a resource-rich country. Now, those resources are hard to get out. They're very expensive. But China sees an opportunity there, as they have in a lot of places around the world, particularly when they have a chance to point out the U.S. failed here, where China can try to make it a success. And so that's part of what they see going on here. Now, there are challenges, right? We just saw the Taliban Pakistan, right, the TTP, conducted an attack in Pakistan where Chinese nationals were killed. That's obviously going to be a point of friction between the Taliban supporters in Afghanistan with the Pakistani Taliban. But we'll see how this thing plays out. We see the Pakistani leadership already saying they might grant pardons to the Pakistani Taliban, even after the 70 attacks we've seen just since the Taliban have taken power in Afghanistan. More to come. And they're talking about pardons because they want to make a deal between China, Pakistan, and the Taliban.
When we talk about China, how much do you think China wants to be involved in the Afghanistan story? Is it only to make sure that there's stability in Xinjiang? Or do they want more in the power game? And do they really, because Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires.
Correct.
Will another empire want to?
Listen, China has advanced by staying out of these conflicts in the last 20 to 30 years. You haven't seen them engage, all over the world like the U.S. has, so they haven't put themselves in the opportunity to fail, similar to what the U.S. challenges had in Afghanistan. China has difficult issues with the Muslim community in that particular region. That's not going away. I mean, there's 1.5 million in some of these what do they call it, concentration camps, and that's something that they have to, if you're China, you have to figure out how you can bridge some type of relationship with Taliban in hopes of trying to quell the unrest that naturally exists there in that region with the Chinese government.
Would you say that this Afghanistan crisis has come as a boon for China? Until 2 months back, everyone was talking about holding China accountable, what they've done with the pandemic and how the world needs to do more to seek those answers. This current US president instituted an inquiry into the origins of the pandemic, which did not yield very much. But suddenly the narrative has turned on its head, and now everyone is talking about America's botched up withdrawal, and China is making an entry into the power vacuum left by the US.
Well, it certainly is a challenge, right? There's no question that regardless of what you think about whether the U.S. should have remained in Afghanistan or not, right, what's clear is the withdrawal faced significant challenges, right? Did not go well. But we doubled down on it and still pulled out. And now China sees an opportunity, right, as does Pakistan. Pakistan sees an opportunity to expand its influence in the region, which is already significant. And China sees a chance to ride on top of that and play a role. Part of that is quelling their own problems in the Xinjiang province, right, with the 1 million Muslims, as Brian correctly said, in these internment camps, gulags. And so, China's coming out of this looking better to the world, looking more powerful, right? And once again, the U.S. is not doing what we need to do, which is to stand by our allies and oppose our adversaries in a very clear way. We've got to change that narrative. One way to do that is to build upon our relationship with the Quad, right? With India, with Australia. You just saw a major defense deal with Australia, right? That needs to happen with India too. Now, India has a part to play in that too, right? You can't be buying S-400s from the Russians if you want to do a deal with the U.S. And so that's part of the negotiation that's got to take place between India and the United States to really get to a stronger place. There are real opportunities for our countries to really come together and be a bulwark against China, but that's going to take some sacrifices on both sides.
Pakistan and China both do not share a good relationship with India. And now they're both coming together into a third theater of conflict, which is Afghanistan, which has also become a base for terrorists. How worried should India be, and what are India's best bets in terms of allies and partners to work on this?
Listen, I think it's pretty clear. India should be very worried. India should be worried about the Russia relationship as well. I mean, at some point, they're going to have to make a decision, as good as it's been, as they feel it's been with the Russia relationship. Prioritizing a relationship with the American relationship is probably more important because you're dealing with China, because you're going to be dealing with Afghanistan. And, that vacuum needs to be filled somewhere. And I think, if you're looking, if India's looking to fill that vacuum, it should turn to the U.S. because there's conflicted allegiances right now with China and Russia. And you don't want to be in that position where China and Russia align against India's interests. And that could easily happen.
Right. I'm going to wrap with this. It's a windy morning here, and I'm not sure if this will lead to winds of change as well in the conversations that world leaders will have in the days ahead. But thank you very much for sharing your perspective with us.
Thank you.
Gravitas live and direct from WION Studios in Washington, D.C.
Last week, before we left for Washington, D.C., we told you about an impending financial disaster. We showed you pictures of Chinese citizens protesting at the corporate headquarters of Evergrande, the biggest player in Chinese real estate, also the world's most indebted real estate company at the moment. Evergrande owes more than $300 billion, $300 billion. It is already missing its loan payments. Some protesters have tried to commit suicide just to make a point. It's a serious crisis. A collapse of Evergrande could start a financial pandemic. We've been reporting on this. Turns out the problem is bigger than what we initially saw. The United States too is staring at defaults. And I'm not talking about a company here. I'm talking about the government. The government of the United States of America could default on its own debts. American citizens could run out of cash. And if that happens, scenes like the ones we witnessed from China could play out in the US too. Such a situation will be a financial Armageddon. What are world leaders doing about it? What are Chinese and American leaders doing about it? Not very much so far. More than 100 leaders have gathered in New York, but they have said nothing about the debt troubles of the US and China and how they will impact the rest of the world. Are they ignoring an impending global financial crisis? Our next report tells you why the world needs to brace for this. On Tuesday, Xi Jinping had a message for world leaders. The Chinese president wants them to focus on post-pandemic recovery.
We must revitalize the economy and pursue more robust, greener and more balanced global development. Development holds the key to people's well-being. Facing the severe shocks of COVID-19, we need to work together to steer global development towards a new stage of balanced, coordinated and inclusive growth.
The global economy is still reeling from the pandemic that began in China. Now the Chinese could unleash another pandemic, a financial one, something that Xi Jinping did not talk about at the United Nations General Assembly. China's biggest real estate player, Evergrande, is a ticking time bomb. It owes more than $300 billion to various creditors, money it cannot pay back. On Monday, Evergrande missed interest payments to two large banks. By Thursday, the company has payments worth $120 million due. Evergrande has struck a deal to make one of these payments, but that doesn't even begin to solve the crisis. China's Evergrande is being compared to Lehman Brothers, the company that was audited by Ernst & Young. This is the office of Ernst & Young. They had to settle for $10 million for helping Lehman Brothers dupe investors. That was the charge against them. Now China's Evergrande possibly faces the same fate. Although Chinese state media say that this is a company that is too big to fail. We know better than to put our trust in the Chinese basket. The question is, what are world leaders going to do about it? This is an impending financial pandemic that may start in China and spread to the rest of the world. As world leaders gather here this week for the United Nations General Assembly, are they going to come up with a plan to deal with this? Or are they going to brush it under the carpet? The collapse of Evergrande will have a ripple effect on the rest of the world. The company has borrowed money from practically everyone. Its creditors range from banks to suppliers to average Chinese citizens. Evergrande took cash deposits from more than 1 million home buyers. They're yet to deliver these apartments. The company borrowed from tens of thousands of its own employees. Even foreign creditors have a sizable exposure. Evergrande owes them $20 billion, and that may just be the tip of the iceberg.
The Chinese government tends to try to hide these problems under a sea of liquidity, and the level of transparency and corporate governance is quite limited relative to other economies. So it's very difficult for us to know the true extent of the financial hole of both Evergrande and the property developer sector. If they decide to bail out Evergrande, the problem might be, as we saw, for example, in the Lehman crisis, that they need to bail out not just Evergrande, but other property developers.
The warnings were always there. Last year, a report said that China's property boom is a $52 trillion bubble. Evergrande could just be the first of the many companies to fail. By August this year, Chinese developers had defaulted on more than $6 billion worth of loans. The Evergrande crisis is eerily similar to what happened in America in 2008. and it could have an impact on the US economy. Washington has not raised any alarm bells yet because they're fighting their own battles. America, the biggest economy in the world, is facing a cash crunch. Here in America, there's a new fear that the country is running out of money. And this could happen as early as October. That's next month. I'm standing in front of the US Department of Treasury, and the mood in this building is tense. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has issued a warning to American lawmakers. She's asked them to raise the debt ceiling. And this is a request that has gone to the US Capitol not once, not twice, but numerous times. Yellen says that the US is heading into a new financial crisis, and that soon millions of Americans may not have enough cash, that American soldiers overseas may not get their pay. The question is, how did things come to such a pass? Were there no warnings? And what does this crisis mean for America's grand plans, more specifically Joe Biden's $3.5 trillion spending plan? This problem is about America's massive national debt. It stands at around $28.4 trillion as of today. This is the maximum the American government can borrow. But even with these loans, the Biden administration is unable to meet its expenses. Sometime in October, the US government could default on these loans. Millions of Americans could be strapped for cash. Nearly 50 million senior citizens will stop getting their Social Security checks. And American soldiers may not get their salaries. The Biden administration has no option but to borrow more. Else the federal government will not be able to pay its bills. US President Joe Biden is facing opposition from his own party. The Democrats hold the majority in the US Congress, but they're pushing back against Biden's spending plans. The United States and China are the world's biggest economies. They're both staring at defaults. This economic distress is an indication of a brewing global financial crisis, one that could kick off a financial pandemic at a time when the world is still struggling with the Wuhan virus. Bureau Report, WION World is One. What's the big message at the UNGA this year? Has to be post-pandemic recovery. World leaders could have easily stayed home. They could have sent video messages, but they're flying in for the optics to show the world that things are getting back to normal. But for that, you need cooperation, you need trust, something that Britain has historically lacked. Their latest slight is against India. Prime Minister Boris Johnson wants to revive the tourism industry. He's inviting the world to visit Britain. But there's a catch. Only certain vaccines will get you seamless entry, like Moderna, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca. No quarantine, straight entry into Britain. But what if you got Covishield, AstraZeneca Covishield? Britain's first list of recognized vaccines does not even mention it. The millions of people who got Covishield were asked to quarantine. It made no sense. Covishield is basically the same as AstraZeneca, same vaccine, different bottle. So why the discrimination? India warned Britain of reciprocal action. The Foreign Secretary said talks were underway to resolve the issue, and earlier today we got the result. Covishield has been recognized by Britain. But don't book your tickets yet. Fully vaccinated Indians will still have to undergo quarantine. What for? Because Britain does not trust India's vaccine certificates. That's right. If you got Covishield from Antigua, no quarantine. If same for Canada. If you got Covishield from India, though, Britain will quarantine you. The reasoning is absolutely bogus. Apparently, they do not trust India's vaccine certificates. Why? Well, they won't say. It's a classic case of British high-handedness. Some are calling it vaccine apartheid. Well, hard to argue with that. India's vaccine certificates are handled by CoWIN. It's an open source platform. More than 50 countries have expressed interest in it. The government of India plans to share it with the world. In July, 147 countries attended the CoWIN Global Conclave. 147 countries. Still not good enough for Britain. There is no logical explanation for this decision. At least 13 European Union countries recognize Covishield. So will the United States from November. But Britain is absorbed in stereotypes. They still think India is the land of forgery and counterfeits. You would expect this 70 years back, but not today. India is a world leader in modern technology. Doubting the CoWIN platform is doubting India's genuineness. Is Britain trying to say that India is fudging its numbers? And if so, what proof does it have? Medical experts have hailed India's vaccination drive. Not only is India inoculating its own people, it will resume vaccine exports by October. Doesn't sound like a country fudging numbers. The fact is, this is not about authenticity, this is about prejudice, and I will tell you why. This is what a vaccination certificate looks like in America. It's not even digital, it is handwritten. There is very little information, your name, your date of birth, your vaccine details. Plus, it's pretty easy to make a fake one. There are Instagram accounts selling fake US certificates. You can get one for $25. A perfect replica sells for $200. Is this the authenticity Britain is looking for? From October 4th, Americans can practically waltz into Britain, no quarantine, no questions asked. All they need is the scrap of paper we just showed you. Compare this to India. The COVID certificate has a barcode, your Aadhaar number, your unique health ID, a beneficiary reference, the name of your vaccinator, the batch number of your jab. Apparently, that's not enough data. Britain needs to stop pretending that this is about technology or authenticity. It's about perception, specifically Britain's false perception about India. As I said, we need trust to beat this pandemic. We need cooperation. And right now, Britain is acting more like a colonial empire and less like a modern democracy. In his opening remarks at the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, criticized billionaires for joyriding to space as millions go hungry on Earth. He did not take any names, but it doesn't take a genius to guess who he was talking about. The owner of Virgin Galactic, Richard Branson, and Amazon's executive chairman, Jeff Bezos. This summer, both men flew into outer space in their respective private rockets. The trips cost billions of dollars each. They were met with public fury. Both of these billionaires were criticized for going on space excursions but refusing to pay their taxes. Jeff Bezos in particular. You see, Amazon's tax-dodging record is astonishing, especially in the United Kingdom. In 2019, the company collected $17.5 billion in revenue in the UK, but paid just $400 million in corporate tax. And in 2020, it collected $28 billion in revenue, but paid just $670 million in taxes. How did they do this? By offshoring their revenues to countries with low tax rates. Now, the British Prime Minister, who's currently in New York, is said to have raised this issue on Tuesday. He met Jeff Bezos on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session. Look at the images. Bezos, accompanied by his girlfriend Laura Sanchez, visited UK's diplomatic residence in New York. He held at least an hour-long discussion with Prime Minister Johnson. In a tweet about the interaction, Bezos said, and I'm quoting, "Good exchange of ideas on climate change with a lot of passion around preserving and restoring the natural world. The meeting was useful and enjoyable." Enjoyable, he says. Was it though? The statement by 10 Downing Street tells a different story, and I'm quoting again. The Prime Minister raised the issue of taxation and hoped progress could be made in implementing the G7 agreement on tax. What is the G7 agreement on tax? It's a proposal agreed upon by G7 nations in June this year. It seeks to set up a minimum corporate tax rate for multinational companies like Amazon. This is being done in order to stop them from evading taxes by offshoring their revenues. The agreement seeks to make such companies pay at least 15% tax in every country they operate in. The question is, will they? Experts say Amazon could easily sidestep this agreement, and I will explain how. The criterion for selecting which companies to tax is their profit margin, which has a 10% threshold. So you have to have a profit of at least 10%. Above that margin, 20% of any profit companies make will get taxed. Now, this is a loophole that Amazon could exploit. It may be one of the wealthiest companies in the world, but its profit margin is abysmally low. In 2020, it was only 6.3%. How do they do this? Amazon basically reinvests its profits heavily. It makes a vast majority of the money it earns and invests it in new businesses. This business model, which prioritizes growth over profit, could help Amazon easily escape the G7 tax agreement. You see, they're making profits, but they're not showing them as profits. It's not a question of if, but when. So coming back to the question, can G7 nations make Jeff Bezos pay his taxes? Well, he's a capitalist at the end of the day. He's not going to pay his taxes out of kindness. There's no stopping him from exploiting the loopholes. So what countries need to do is plug the loopholes. The UK needs to come up with the right tax framework. Big tech companies need to be reined in. They want to dictate the laws they operate in. One bloc is now aggressively trying to push back. The European Union. They are taking on Apple. The EU plans to come up with a law. They want users to have one cable to charge all of their devices. So whether it's your smartphone or the tablet, you'll use one charger for everything. Well, Apple, of course, is unhappy about this because it wants to sell chargers that use Apple's proprietary technology. But this new law may not leave them with an option. Apple could be forced to ditch the lighting cables. Our next report tells you more.
Does your bag have a tangled mess of cables like this? Are you forced to carry a different cable for everything? One to charge your phone, another to charge your tablet, and a completely different charger for your headphones. Do you wish there was one charger to charge everything? If you are living in the European Union, you could break free from this tangle of chargers soon. The bloc is pushing a law, one that makes common chargers mandatory. So whether it's your phone, your tablet, or your headphones, one cable will charge everything. This is good news for the consumers, but a big setback for tech giant Apple. If you use an Apple device, you would know why. Apple uses its own charging port, called the Lightning port, on all of its products. If the European Union pushes this law, Apple will be forced to dump this Lightning port. The company will have to adopt something that is more commonly used, like the USB Type-C. Apple has fiercely pushed back against universal chargers. It claims that forcing common connectors could deter innovation and create a mountain of electronic waste. But the European Commission is adamant. It defends its plans, saying the move will instead benefit the environment, because the consumers won't have to buy new chargers for every device they purchase. Apple's position is only hurting its brand. The company's critics say Apple wants a monopoly on accessories and reduce the choices consumers have. So it is pushing back against the proposal. The European Union has wanted a common charger for more than a decade. Now it has finally got down to writing a law about it. And this time Apple will not have an option but to comply. Bureau Report, WION The World is One.
The building behind me is the symbol of America's power, the White House, the home of the US president. But do you know who built it? Slaves. In fact, most of the famous buildings in Washington were built by slaves. It's an undeniable part of American history, like these pictures, white men whipping slaves. Not only was it legal, it was encouraged. The whip was the symbol of America's bigotry, of racism and white supremacy, and now that symbol is back. Let me show you some pictures. These are not from the last century or from a medieval drama. They are from the Texas border on Monday. These men on horseback are US Border Patrol. The people they're herding are migrants. And I say herding on purpose because there is no other way to describe what they're doing. The border troops are carrying whips. They're beating up migrants and pushing them back into the river. These are Haitian migrants. Thousands of them have amassed at the US border. They have undertaken a long and dangerous journey. They have walked hundreds of kilometers. They've crossed rivers, all in search of the American dream. This is their temporary refuge. A massive bridge in Del Rio, Texas. At one point, 12,000 people were living here. There are children, there are pregnant women. They pitched their tents and awaited their turn, but the US had other plans. They shut the border and began deporting the migrants. Talk about cruelty. These people were fleeing poverty and violence back home. They are desperate. They were desperate enough to set out on foot. And what does the US do? Send them back to the same living hell.
I feel disappointed because we crossed over to the US and it wasn't what we expected. They were very mean to us. Just imagine, they treated us like we were trash. They didn't give us food, water, there were no doctors, nothing. A lot of children, pregnant women. Things are really hard for us.
I have 2 children. I have been hungry for 4 days with children. and now I have left the United States to find food in Mexico. People in the United States don't give us anything, just water. Since children only receive water, children are going hungry. We are out in the open.
No food, no water, no doctors, just plain cruelty. That's what these migrants got from America. They were beaten with whips and deported against their will. Does the US government have a response? Here's what Vice President Kamala Harris said.
What I saw depicted about those individuals on horseback treating human beings the way they were is horrible. And I fully support what is happening right now, which is a thorough investigation into exactly what is going on there. But human beings should never be treated that way, and I'm deeply troubled about it.
The Vice President is quote-unquote deeply troubled. How unfortunate. If only she had the power to do something about it. America is the richest country in the world. It can help these people, but Joe Biden chooses not to. What's worse, he is using a Trump-era policy to deport these migrants. Donald Trump's policy permits the US to detain and deport migrants, no questions asked, and no scope for asylum requests. Now, Joe Biden is using that very same policy, denying these migrants a fair chance, and the same Biden was lecturing the world on human rights yesterday. Listen to this.
As we pursue diplomacy across the board, the United States will champion the democratic values that go to the very heart of who we are as a nation and a people. Freedom, equality, opportunity, and a belief in the universal rights of all people. It's stamped into our DNA as a nation.
Hollow words from the president. He talks about opportunity, yet shuts the border. He talks about universal rights, yet his border troops are whipping migrants. Democracy may be in America's DNA, but so is cruelty and racism. Immigration is a touchy subject here. Some US politicians say it's not their problem. Well, they're wrong. It is their problem. These migrants are not on a picnic. They're fleeing political instability and natural disaster, and America is directly responsible for both. For decades, the CIA toppled regimes in Central America, as a result of which these countries are poor and unstable. They cannot spend billions to recover from cyclones and tsunamis like the US. And by the way, that is climate change, another gift from the West. The migrant crisis undermines every single commitment made by Joe Biden. He wants a seat at the UN Human Rights Council, but these deportations are a violation of international law. Once again, America's words and actions are miles apart. But who will question the mighty Americans? Apparently, power is an excuse for abuse. And now let's tell you what else is making news around the world. Time for Gravitas Global Headlines.
Hours after President Biden spoke at the United Nations, an F-16 fighter jet was seen soaring through the Manhattan skies to intercept a single-engine Cessna plane that had entered a restricted flying area. The incident is now under investigation. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson met US President Joe Biden amid the diplomatic row with France. Both Biden and Johnson hailed the submarine deal and the AUKUS strategic partnership and underscored their commitment to tackling climate change. The World Health Organization has strengthened its air quality guidelines, saying air pollution is now one of the biggest environmental threats to human health, causing 7 million premature deaths a year. At least 5 people, including civilians, have been killed in 2 separate attacks in Afghanistan. No group has claimed responsibility yet, but the ISIS-K took responsibility for a similar attack last week. A magnitude 6 earthquake rattled southeastern Australia, shaking buildings, knocking down walls, and sending Melbourne residents running into the streets. Protesters took to the streets of the Argentine capital Buenos Aires demanding more jobs and social benefits. Hundreds filled the square in front of the presidential palace as President Alberto Fernandez, speaking remotely at the UN General Assembly, praised efforts to grapple with Argentina's debt of $45 billion to the IMF. The protesters said the government had cut financial aid and food programs to divert the money to pay foreign debt. Indigenous activists delivered a tree to the embassy of Norway in Brazil amid the rise in deforestation in the Amazon. It was a symbolic protest by the activists seeking refuge status in an environment-friendly country. A volcanic eruption in La Palma in the Canary Islands has left entire fields, roads, houses and swimming pools covered with lava. So far, the eruption has prompted the evacuation of around 6,000 people. Sunrisers Hyderabad pacer T. Natarajan has tested positive for COVID-19 at the ongoing Indian Premier League in the UAE. The left-armer has been placed in isolation alongside all-rounder Vijay Shankar and 5 support staff members who were identified as close contacts. The rest of the Hyderabad team tested negative, which allowed their match against Delhi Capitals on Wednesday to go ahead as scheduled. Holders Manchester City have begun their quest for a record 5th straight EFL Cup title with a 6-1 drubbing of third-tier side Wycombe Wanderers. The hosts rallied from a goal down with Riyad Mahrez netting a brace and Kevin De Bruyne, Phil Foden and Ferran Torres also on target. Liverpool also progressed to the last 16 with a 3-0 win over Norwich City.
The world is not the happiest place right now. There is a global health crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a brewing economic crisis. Like I said, it's not the best of times. The question is, how do we navigate this? How do we sail to kinder waters? Well, first of all, we need the world to respond as one. Keep interests of various groups in mind and hold to task perpetrators of the crisis. China, for example. The world needs to make China pay, and I've said this before on numerous occasions, and I will say it again. The world must make China pay. And from where I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., it looks like the world is finally coming together to make that happen. The White House, right behind me, is all set to host the first ever in-person Quad meeting. The leaders of the world's biggest democracies will be meeting to hold China accountable. 2. The world needs more such cooperation between various countries, countries that follow the rule of law, countries that are multilateral in their approach and global in spirit, countries that do not engage in unnecessary vaccine politicking, that make no big promises on the world stage with little intention on delivering. You heard China a day ago. You will get another sample in 2 days from now when Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan addresses the General Assembly. What the world needs is real leaders, real leadership and global strategic partnership, the kind that India shares with the United States, with Australia, with Japan. As we speak, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is on his way to the city to meet the leaders of Quad countries. He's expected to touch down at 6 p.m. local time, which will be 3:30 a.m. IST. Over the next 2 days, he will also hold a series of bilaterals, address the biggest challenges of our time. When the Indian Prime Minister lands in Washington, D.C., he will look to strengthen security collaboration and identify priorities for future engagement. India will also secure its path to leadership in the post-pandemic world. Here in WION's Washington studios, we are counting down to the high-profile meetings. We'll see you tomorrow. Take care and stay safe.
هذا مثلا كل هذا الاسماء